Hello, everyone. My name is Valerie Norble. I'm NASBE's editorial director. We have convened today such a great panel of top experts on the research and practice of literacy instruction, and they're going to help us think through some implications for equity of the disruptions that so many of our students have been experiencing. We have the perfect moderator in Dr. Tanji Reed Marshall, Director of P12 Practice at the Education Trust, previously at Virginia Tech, also previously before that, a literacy specialist in the Charlotte Mecklenburg schools in North Carolina. Her full bio is on the Whova app, as are all those of our esteemed panelists today. Please use the Q&A feature to ask your questions. Hit refresh if you are having technical difficulties. Try that first. This session is being recorded today and will be available to all attendees later. And with that, Dr. Marshall, thanks for moderating today.
Valerie, it is absolutely a pleasure to be here with you and NASBE, and I look forward to the great conversation we're going to have. You are indeed about to have one of the best conversations around literacy. If you're like me and you consider yourself a lit head, this is going to be one of your favorite webinars that you have the opportunity to attend today. So joining us in our conversation is Tim Shanahan, Distinguished Professor Emeritus at the University of Illinois in Chicago, where he is founding director of the UIC Center for Literacy. Previously, he was director of reading for the Chicago Public Schools. He is author, editor of more than 300 publications, which I'm sure I have half at home right now. My husband's asking for me to put them away somewhere. Teaching with the Common Core standards for the English language arts, early childhood literacy, and developing literacy in second language learners. His research emphasizes the connections between learning to read and learning to write, literacy in the disciplines, and improvement of reading achievement. Professor Shanahan is past president of the IRA, International Reading Association. He served on an advisory board for the National Institute for Literacy under Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama. Professor Shanahan was a member of the National Reading Panel. He chaired the National Early Literacy Panel, and he helped write the Common Core state standards. He was inducted to the Reading Hall of Fame in 2007 and is a former first grade teacher. For more information, visit his blog, www.shanahanonliteracy.com. And I promise you, if you do, you will be returning to there, much like many of us do. Up next is Dr. Nell Duke, another one of my fan favorites. I'm fangirling today, so please join me in that. Is professor in literacy, language, and culture, and also in the combined program in education and psychology at the University of Michigan. Duke's work focuses on early literacy development, particularly among children living in economic poverty. Duke has been named one of the most influential education scholars in U.S. In EdWeek. In 2014, Duke was awarded the P. David Pearson Scholarly Influence Award from the Literacy Research Association. And in 2018, she received the International Literacy Association's William S. Gray Citation of Merit for outstanding contributions to research, theory, practice, and policy. Duke speaks and consults widely on literacy education and is an active member of several literacy-related organizations. Among other roles, she currently serves as advisor for the Public Broadcasting Service Corporation for Public Broadcasting Ready to Learn initiative and for the Council of Chief State School Officers. Her Twitter handle is @NellDuke. Please make sure you follow her. Next up, but certainly not least, is a voice that we need to hear because voices of teachers always matter. We have joining us today is Aaron Grossman, fourth grade distance learning teacher in Reno, Nevada. He was his district's 2017 Teacher of the Year and a Nevada 2018 Teacher of the Year finalist. Grossman co-created the website www.justtwoteachers.com, where he posts curricular supplements for the benchmark advanced reading program, strongly aligned to the expectation of the standards. You can learn more about him and what his students are up to at www.room360.org. And so let us get started on this conversation. The pandemic has undoubtedly exacerbated inequities for public school students. How can state policymakers make sure remote learning is working for all students? I want to ask Nell Duke to start us off with this conversation on policymakers and helping ensure that these inequities can begin to be addressed.
Thank you so much. And before I start, I just want to say the Twitter handle is at Nell K Duke. And I say that only because at Nell Duke has been banned from Twitter, and I don't want you to get the wrong idea about me. So this way, you know, I have not been banned from Twitter, but it's at Nell K Duke.
At Nell K Duke. All right. We'll put that in the chat for correction. Thank you.
Thank you. This is a really, really important question that you're asking. I think a lot of us are very concerned that the pandemic is going to exacerbate what we already didn't know to be an inequitable education system for students. And certainly one of the major ways that we need to address that is to try to make sure that we're getting high-speed internet access and devices to as many students as possible nationally. We really should have done that before the pandemic, but now that we're in the pandemic, it becomes all the more pressing. And I think if you're State Board of Ed members or other policymakers and you're thinking, well, it's not worth that kind of investment when the pandemic's going to be over in a year, I just want to point out that this is an investment that's going to stay with us, because homework, the ability to, engage with discourse communities that you're learning with, all of those things are dependent upon high-speed internet access, pandemic or not. So just investing really heavily in access, I think, is really important. And then just recognizing as well that it's not just having access to those things, but it's having high quality instruction provided through those mechanisms and a place for students to learn, opening up learning centers for students, in the housing complexes where they may live, or opening up, portions of school building for learning centers for kids who really just don't have a place within their home where learning can happen. And then, of course, there are all the things that we can do at the classroom level. And I think some of those are worth mentioning. Something as simple as allowing students to use backgrounds in their video conferencing so that if they're not feeling comfortable with people seeing into their home, they have that background, up to sort of prevent that kind of thing. Making sure that, we continue to connect to and validate students' cultural backgrounds and the assets that they have in their home in our teaching. Those are just a sampling of the ways that at all levels we can be working toward equity.
Absolutely. Tim, will you go ahead and follow up with that? I think you have another perspective to bring to this as well. And then when he's done, Aaron, fill us in about what you're seeing at the classroom side as well.
Yeah, I think what Nell has said is absolutely right. I can't disagree with anything there. Let me add to her litany of needs and things we ought to be paying attention to. The one that I read about all the time in the papers is the technology. You've got to have a tablet or a laptop, and you certainly have to have the bandwidth on the internet and so on. And boy, I fully agree with that. And Nell has said that. But I also, from watching what's been going on, especially for the younger kids, so much of this teaching over the internet is really teachers teaching parents or other adults in the household how to work with their kids. And I think state school boards and other policymakers have to, I think, get out there much more out in front of this in terms of we need to provide more education for parents in terms of their role in all of this and how they can be most helpful in this and what they need to do to support their kids within these lessons. I'm not seeing a lot of those kinds of stories in the media. I'm not hearing a lot from states that are putting out, parent education right now. I think we need to add that to everything that Nell said, and I'll get out of Aaron's way.
Of course, you know, and I'll use my accountable talk and say I respectfully agree with Dr. Duke and Dr. Shanahan as well. So I'm living part of that. And I guess, you know, I have two responses or two additions to this. The first is to build on Dr. Shanahan's idea of creating asynchronous opportunities, not just for our students, but also for our families, that this is a unique opportunity insofar as people are being normed to this idea of finding things on YouTube or whatever learning platform your district has and learning through video software. And then moreover, school districts, perhaps not as quickly as they could be, but they're beginning to present content for lots of stakeholders. And I think, again, it's just something we're all being normed and we're getting accustomed to. The other part I would add to that, especially with some policymakers on joining this webinar, is you know, we have old laws on the books, and maybe this is an opportunity to revisit some of those. And just as two sort of examples, the first is many states, including mine, have laws governing the use of core programs to supplement core programs. And what I mean by that is when brick and mortar, right, we have physical textbooks, and that's a real limiting factor as we're trying to teach through a screen. So the fact that I can't avail myself of high quality, highly aligned materials right now is deeply frustrating, and I think exacerbates some of the challenges that we're contending with. And then moreover, there are a lot of states, and myself included, we have laws that require certain expenditure on textbooks. So in the state of Nevada, it's called MER, the minimum expenditure requirement. And that is reduced to $121.27 per child in my school district, which may not sound like a lot, but when we're talking about one-to-one devices and access to high-speed internet, $121.27 can get you pretty far. But we're restricted. We're restricted insofar as how we can spend that money. And of course, we're restricted in what kind of resources we can currently use. So I think this is an opportunity for those people watching this webinar to revisit some of these policies, laws, and begin to rethink the implications for our classrooms.
Excellent point there, all three of you. And Aaron, you've led us to our next question as opening the door on challenge. And so I want us to think about what are the challenges and opportunities, right? We've sort of begun to bubble up some of these. Want us to now dig a little bit deeper into the challenges and opportunities in teaching reading and writing using these digital tools. So Tim, you are one of the nation's top leading voices on this. So I'm going to ask you to kick us off, and then we'll go to Nell, and then Aaron. We'll go to Tim, then Aaron, then Nell.
Well, you know, I think if you take each of these suggestions that we've made, you know, so if you say, gee, we're going to have to invest in you know, better infrastructure so that the kids have the technology and the access to technology. And Nell said it, the fact is, once that's in place and that investment is being made, that's going to be an incredible opportunity for our boys and girls going forward. If teachers can depend upon that, I mean, I remember vividly at the university when we started using technology heavily, and it was always, initially, it was a really tough thing because the teachers that we teach may have the technology or may not. And so, you know, we were kind of back and forth on that. Gee, could you use that? Could you give the kinds of assignments that technology makes possible? Or would that be unfair because too many of the students in our classes wouldn't have it? At some point, there was a tipping point. You know, at some point, so many of the teachers had it, it was just no question. And then magically everybody seemed to have it. And we could do much more interesting, involving, educationally positive things. The piece I added about, you know, parent education, you know, we've got studies going back a long way showing that parents can play a very big, important role in the teaching of children. But in many families and many households, parents sort of keep their hands off of that. In fact, they even can feel like it's disrespectful that, you know, if they get too involved in their kids' teaching, then maybe they're insulting Aaron or other teachers like him, when Aaron would love the help of those parents, but the parents aren't sure about that. You know, if we get into a mode where parents are expected to be more involved in their children's education, you're certainly going to have more learning. And Aaron's notion of let's get more flexible in some of our policies so that we're able to meet our kids' needs more effectively and efficiently, especially given the diversity across school districts in any single state, that kind of policy review and keeping things flexible is something that should be an ongoing aspect of any kind of educational policy. So I think every single idea that we've put on the table so far is something that, if it were continued on after the crisis, would be terrific for boys and girls all over the country.
That's great. And, I think the point is really well taken about the idea of including parents as much as possible. And I think that presents an opportunity, is being really explicit with how they can best assist their kids. And so when talking about some of the challenges, one of the real challenges for me, I'll highlight just a couple, is, I'm somebody who's persuaded by the evidence, by somebody like Dr. Tim Brzezinski, who says, right, fluency matters. It may never appear in a top 20 of what's hot in education each year, but still incredibly important. So fluency is really compromised in terms of teaching it. I can model it, but all of those experiences that would typically happen in brick and mortar, we get less of that. So if I can invite a partner like a parent in on that, I think that presents an opportunity, especially if I can be explicit of how they can support it. In terms of, with these challenging things, what's difficult about the question is everything is harder teaching online. So so there are certainly opportunities, but we know, for example, you're blind teaching online. When I have a kid in front of me and they're on a screen, I don't really know what they're doing. I don't see what's in front of them. I can ask them to write something, but I can't really see what they're writing, not until a more summative kind of moment in which they hold up what they produced. So these are difficult things, but I also think there are opportunities to really reconsider how we've designed instruction altogether, which gets at that inequities within education. So for the first time, somebody like me doesn't necessarily have to be limited to the kids on my current roster. I think, there's an invitation, or there's an opportunity to invite anybody in on this. And I would say something similar to, I'm, the art teacher who a PFA might have fundraised for in the state of Nevada, because we don't have art teachers. Maybe there are other kids who can participate in that. And I probably should have qualified all of this with a dependent clause, like assuming everybody has access. So we're working backwards from that, because I do know that's a challenge that we raised earlier.
I don't, again, disagree with anything either the panelists said. And I think Erin's comments about, the challenges from the teaching side of this are so important. I'll just add a few, maybe a little bit Pollyanna-ish ideas about opportunities here. So one of the things I've been doing for years is trying to get teachers of young children to spend more time with children in small groups. And I'm not talking here about level-based groups or ability groups, but needs-based groups or interest-based groups where the teacher pulls together children who really need the same teaching point and pulls them together and provides that really high-quality instruction. And we have loads of research that small group instruction is really important for literacy development, many, many models of small group instruction that are effective at raising achievement. But it's hard for teachers to do it. It's hard for teachers to do it, in a classroom, let alone online, right? And the messaging isn't always clear about how important small group instruction is. But I continue to try to beat that drum, particularly because some of the research suggests that small group instruction is especially powerful for some of our most vulnerable learners. So our English language learners, or dual language learners, multi-language learners, they really benefit from small group instruction. There's research to suggest that kids who have significant learning difficulties especially benefit from small group instruction. We know that more equity effective teachers, teachers who are better at raising achievement for all learners, tend to put kids in small groups more. So anyway, I've been saying this for quite some time. Now enter COVID-19 and remote teaching, and I feel like maybe there is more small group instruction going on. I talk with a lot of teachers of young children who just can't have 20, 25, children in front of them for prolonged periods of time and feel like it's working remotely. And so they're moving to that small group instruction, and maybe this will catalyze continued small group instruction even after the pandemic is over. So for me, that's one opportunity. And a second opportunity I want to flag is that We have a lot of things we do in our classrooms because people have always done them. They're kind of these holdovers, right? Well, that's how my mentor teacher did it, or, you know, that's how we did it when I was a kid. And they just kind of stay there. And I feel like I'm seeing some of those dip away. I'll give an example of calendar time. You know, from a research point of view, I can't offer a lot of data to suggest that calendar time is really moving the needle for our children. But it takes up a significant chunk of the day in a lot of classrooms. Well, I think calendar time is falling by the wayside. At least I've seen, it's definitely decreasing in a remote teaching context. The morning worksheets where kids come in and they get, worksheets they're supposed to do a word search or this or that. I mean, there's not evidence to show that greater amounts of worksheet completion lead to higher achievement for kids. So hopefully, that may be dropping out. And so as we drop out some of these less effective practices, that makes room for more effective practices that I hope will, continue post-pandemic. So just a couple of notes of optimism there.
Absolutely. And I definitely appreciate that, as do I'm sure our attendees. You raised an interesting term and you said equity effective. And I have an idea in my mind what that might mean. And I'm going to ask you to open our minds to what you mean when you say equity effective instruction. Talk to us about that.
Sure. So there are lines of research where what we do is look at how much value achievement-wise teachers add. So if you look at a given school and school district and you look at all the second grade teachers and you looked at pre and post test data from formal assessments or informal things like how well kids write at the end of the year, just by rating samples. And what you see is that some teachers are just consistently more effective than other teachers. And you can add a note to that, there are teachers who are just more effective at making sure that everybody is gaining. And they're really effective with, for example, students of color, or very effective with students of poverty. And so researchers have looked at this in a bunch of different ways. One of the powerful ways is just these case studies where researchers go in. They often look at more average kinds of teachers, and then they look at the really outstanding teachers, the Aaron Grossmans of, the classroom, and they figure out what are these really effective teachers doing that we're not seeing in the other teachers. For example, researcher Jennifer Turner has a wonderful case study of a teacher who consistently gets really high results with her African-American students. So what is she doing? Anyway, so when I say equity effective teachers, I'm really talking about these teachers who manage through their practice to enact the kind of equitable outcomes that I think we all want for our schools, but that sadly we often don't achieve.
Absolutely. Thank you for that clarification. That's really helpful. And I think I'm probably going to put Jennifer's name in our chat so that everybody can sort of begin to look her up and learn from what she's been doing. Want to be thinking now about professional development. We know how important professional development is, and from a systems leader perspective, we need to offer some insight into how systems leaders can begin to think through this. So what kind of professional development is needed for teachers to more deeply engage all students, again, this is every student, in remote learning, with a particular eye towards students for whom school really hasn't worked so well? So how do we do all of that? Tim, why don't you start us off on that conversation?
Well, one of the things that I've seen over the last 6 or 7 months that we've been dealing with the school shutdowns and everything is that school districts and individual schools are actually either pulling back on professional development, or it's all kind of going online and becoming much shorter. And so, for example, if a school district had contracted with me to come in and spend a day with the teachers in the district, that maybe has become a 1-hour presentation over Zoom, with a 5 or 10 minute, question and answer period. That kind of narrows down what's going to happen. There is absolutely no question that there are all kinds of things about teaching reading and teaching generally. Aaron and Nell have both given examples of those that people need to continue to be trained in and continue to need to work on. And so One thing that policymakers need to pay attention to is just whether professional development is happening at all, whether it's continuing to target that state's educational goals. The second part of it, though, and in some ways both the most interesting part of it, but also the hardest to deal with, is what's special. What do you have to know to do this at a distance? And so, are there things that you can do in teaching oral reading fluency or text reading fluency online that could be effective, even though we don't have any studies of that yet, because no one was trying to deal with that? Or Aaron's, I wanted, listening to both Aaron and Nell, I just so wanted to dovetail on what they were saying. Aaron was talking about this, the possibilities really of teaming and teachers sharing kids and sharing, and essentially breaking down the walls. What we've done is we've gotten rid of the walls, but we've kept them up virtually, since kids are still assigned to one teacher, one class, 25 kids, it's just like it was, except there are no rooms and so on. It seems to me like the small group instruction that Nell was talking, how can you do that effectively online? It's one thing to make a presentation like we're doing here with this panel. It's quite another thing to have, be making a presentation to kids here while another group of kids are off on the side working in a separate room. And it might be a very different thing if, let's say, if Aaron, Nell, and I were all at the same school, we're primary reading teachers. What if I was going to make the presentation in math or in reading? I was going to present the new spelling pattern and tell the kids what we wanted. But then what we were going to do is break the kids into different groups. I could make that presentation to 75 kids as easily as I could make it to 25 kids. And that should open up some flexibility of time and other kinds of things that the group of us could be doing to better meet the needs of those boys and girls. Let me give one example and then I'll get out of the way. I was talking to teachers who in the spring were doing online teaching. And one of the teachers said, by this time of the year, by March, I knew all my boys and girls. I knew who I could depend on in a classroom discussion, that if I called on them, they would lead things in the right way. They'd be a good model for the other kids. They would instigate things. And what I noticed once we went online is I would ask those boys and girls questions and they would give answers like, yes, no. For whatever reason, they were inhibited by the online format of it. I went looking for research on this to see if there were any studies of it. I couldn't find any. I went looking through the teacher literature to see if people were giving advice on how to deal with this. It was silent. There was nothing out there. And over the months, because so many teachers are dealing with it, and we've got so many wonderful teachers out there who are solving problems like that, there has to be a way of building that information into that professional development. I know Aaron has been someone who's actually been grappling with those problems really directly. And so I'd be curious to see what some of his insights are, but there's one example of some of the kinds of things that would need to be part of professional development.
Yeah, Aaron, please go ahead and sort of fill in what Tim was talking about for us.
All right, I'm always so impressed with Dr. Shanahan because I just always feel like you get it, which is you seem to express what so many educators are feeling. And that's exactly so. By pure accident, I put together a cohort of distance learning educators. It's about 125 of us. It's about 30 different school districts who are represented, and there are common themes. And what we've discovered is exactly what Dr. Shanahan alluded to, which is kids that we knew just performed differently online. And we didn't really know names to give some of these things. And as you know, this is nice thing about YouTube is you can start finding answers. And we've learned, and just there are things that I think are more pronounced in this distance or virtual environment. So, working memory, I think, is particularly compromised, especially for some of our most impacted learners. And we didn't know to call it working memory, but now we realize, I don't know, the wallpaper we basically had up in our classroom, we never perceived as a distraction. But when we're putting together these slides for our kids, if they're contain too much information, for some of our kids, it wasn't intentionally done, but it compromised what they could typically do in virtual versus brick and mortar. And then similarly, and this goes back to, I think, a part of what Dr. Duke was describing, which is affective filters are very different in a virtual environment. So we know, right, these things, affective filter for some of our kids are high. So then we need to think about ways that we can lower them. And so having names for some of these things has then allowed us as teachers to start thinking about solutions and then sharing ideas. And then that gets to this idea of professional development. And my big concern right now is the last sort of big educational reform I have gone through was Common Core. And I remember initially, largely speaking, what states and districts did is they did crosswalks. So, you were teaching homophones in 3rd grade and now you're doing it in 2nd grade. And as long as we reconstitute a little bit of this, we're good. And I worry right now that we're just being told, here are your instructional materials you were teaching in brick and mortar, and now you're just going to sort of share them a little bit differently, maybe a Bitmoji slide, but largely speaking, it's going to be the same thing. And I think we're missing an opportunity to really explore the cognitive science, and then moreover, design experiences that are matched to really good research.
Aaron, I'm glad you brought that up because I was thinking about that as you all were speaking. Want us to take our lens up to like the 30,000 foot lens, to the state board of educators lens, because these are decision makers. And each of you have touched on the kinds of work that has to be done, boots on the ground. Want us to think about, from the state board side, what are the levers that a state board of a state director might be able to pull in order to move some of what you're discussing forward. So Aaron, you're talking about, we feel like we're just taking one side and putting it into the other side, like a slinky from one side to the other side, not necessarily something new or revolutionary. So Nell, I want to ask you, how do you think about this through that lens from the state board level, right? Where are their levers to addressing some of what we've been hearing this afternoon?
I think one lever is for state boards to really push districts on looking at their technology regulations and deciding, when some of those, as Aaron suggested earlier, some of those outdated ideas need to go. I'll just give an example that pulls together something that both Tim and Aaron were talking about, which is, the challenges of doing small group instruction online. Well, one of the really clear tools that teachers I'm working with have found to be effective are breakout rooms. So if you can create those virtual breakout rooms, then there's one breakout room you're working with, and there are other breakout rooms doing other things, or you can even put every kid in a different breakout room, and you can, as the teacher, go from breakout room to breakout room, checking in periodically as you also work with a small group. Except that I've talked with districts where the district mandated video conferencing platform doesn't have breakout rooms. So you've lost a tool right there. And that kind of thing where regulations are getting in the way. There's another district I work with where the tech platform that's like a portfolio platforming, I won't say the name, but a specific tech portfolio platform sharing that lots of people were using before the pandemic, and that there are lots of ways to use effectively for young readers and writers, they're not allowed to use it. So it's those kinds of rules. I think, I'd love to see state boards of ed and other policymakers and leaders, help districts get out of their own way around some of these outdated regulations. A second thing, which also connects to what's been said, I think, is that I'd love to see state boards focus on supporting professional development on effective instructional practices with a little bit about how to do those online, as opposed to supporting technology focused professional development. Let me see if I can make that. It's a figure ground issue, right? Do you lead with the technology and then kind of sprinkle some effective practices in there? Or do you lead with effective practices and then talk about how to accomplish those in a remote setting? And to me, it's that latter. It's leading with the effective practices that it really needs to be where our focus is. So I have a couple videos up on my YouTube channel where I've taught small group instruction using research tested instructional techniques, research tested in a face-to-face environment. And I've shown how you can pick up on some tools, simple tools, Google Jamboard and things like that, to make those techniques work online. So for example, I've shown how you can teach phonics lessons in ways that we should be teaching phonics from a research perspective, but how you can do that with online tools. And I'd really much rather see that than a lot of the professional development that I'm seeing out there, including with state supplemental aid, that's really just one tech gizmo and tool after another, but for what end, right? So really would love to see policymakers continue to lead with those effective literacy instructional practices rather than with the tech tools. So those are a couple suggestions at the 30,000 foot level.
Tim, what can you add to that?
I'm going to go back to this consortium that Aaron was describing, this grassroots group of educators who've gotten together to share information. And I would suggest that right now, that's exactly the kind of information that needs to be fed into the system. And it strikes me that educational leaders, instead of hoping that groups of teachers like that will form, ought to be being proactive about it and trying to organize such groups to share information, to share their insights, and to feed those into the system, so that right now there's an awful lot of professional development where people are saying, oh, this is how you do distance learning, and they haven't done distance learning themselves, and they don't have any research on it, but boy, they have opinions. I don't think that's really what's most useful now. This is a time, since we don't have a deep research base on how to do this effectively, we need to have our ears to the ground, figuring out what are teachers figuring out, what's working for them, what are they able to share with each other that can work in multiple places, and when we have those kinds of nuggets, then we need to feed that into the entire system. So I would encourage every state, including my own, to try to form those kinds of statewide consortia to create that information and to make that available to their educators.
I think that's a fantastic suggestion, thinking about what Aaron's group did. And I'm wondering, as you all are talking, we're talking to state boards of education, is there a way or a place where we can think through members of these boards of education meeting with, holding focus groups, learning from teachers in real ways? Is that something that opens a door for more learning? Can y'all speak to something of that nature?
I think that's a brilliant move on the part of state boards of ed, hearing from teachers and families, and other roles in the building. To Tim's point about breaking down these silos, our speech and language pathologists, our reading specialists, which I know is part of your background, the folks that have played those roles in schools for a long time, focus groups with them to find out what really would be helpful in their particular school context, I think is a really great idea.
Aaron, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, of course, again, I love these suggestions, and at a much more micro level, I do have, in my classroom, I call it a task force, but that's exactly what we do. So I meet with my kids and I ask them what's working and what's not. And similarly, I ask my parents the same thing. And you learn from that. For example, I was sharing so many digital tools online that my parents just said, can they get a break? Can they just read a book, right? Great that they have subscriptions to all these services, but man, they just want to use a piece of paper. And I hadn't really thought that well through. So I think that feedback is invaluable. And going back to sort of a similar question, but I think these things bleed together, which is these opportunities. I started meeting with my kids over the summer. And I think if I had sent an email saying, I want to hang out with your child via Zoom for a couple of hours, that would have been received a couple of years ago. It's just incredibly weird. And instead, right, I had these opportunities over the summer to begin assessing my kids, to get to know my kids. We met, we kept it really low key. It was all the sort of fun activities, treasure hunts and Pictionary online, so that when we ultimately launched, we had already built a community, which, we alluded to a little bit earlier, is really hard to do and wildly different in this format. But we had accumulated a number of experiences. So I just think, again, the conversations that typically we couldn't have because of just distance being an issue, we can bridge that now. And then similarly, right, we could communicate in a way that just a couple of years ago would have been kind of perceived as unusual, and now I think it's accepted.
Thank you. I want to switch gears a little bit and ask us to be thinking about ways to prioritize what should be learned. So there's a lot of conversation in the world about unfinished learning or lost learning. And we know that if you haven't learned something, you can't lose it. So it's not actually lost, but the learning has not been finished, the instruction has not been finished. But how do we have a conversation that honors the real stress levels that teachers, schools, school districts, parents, kids, that we're all thinking about? How do we address this notion of prioritizing either skills, prioritizing standards? How do we help state boards of education make those kinds of decisions? And how do we help them then help the others who have to make that? Now, why don't you start us off?
Sure. So I really struggle with that question a little bit because for me, what happens when we start to prioritize standards or we identify power standards or the like is that we inevitably lose some really important teaching and learning opportunities. So the way I'd like to reframe that a little bit is around the idea of looking for how we can pack the most in to any given lesson or activity. So for example, I'm working on developing a curriculum that's full day, and all of the reading and writing instruction connects to what's happening in science and social studies. So that at the same time, I'm both addressing science and social studies and developing reading and writing. And those are, I think, the kinds of things we need to do is try to pack in as much as we can so that we're addressing as many standards as we can, as opposed to cherry picking a few standards to really focus on and then everything else falls out. I'll also just put in a plug for science and social studies education, as I often do. It's really tempting, I think, for teachers and districts serving young children to think, well, let's just hone in on the basic literacy and math skills. That's what's most important anyway. But for a lot of kids, that science and social studies is part of what they really enjoy in school. So that's one. Two, as I've suggested, we can be teaching the two together and simultaneously. And Tim Shanahan's work is really important in terms of helping us understand how there is literacy to be learned that's specific to science and specific to social studies. So that is another opportunity. And finally, I just, as probably many people know, science and social studies knowledge is a really important part of what allows students to become good reading comprehenders later on. So my bottom line is hard to prioritize standards as much as we can. Let's try to hit lots of standards at once. And let's be sure that in the process, we don't drop science and social studies entirely out of the early grades curriculum, which is what I'm seeing in a lot of places.
Tim, she already talked, Nell already mentioned you, so she was headed right in my direction. So I'm pleased to invite you to join this part of our conversation as well.
Yeah, I've heard Nell talk about this idea before, and she points out something really important about it that she didn't today. So let me say it, and that is that this idea of prioritizing certain standards makes much more sense when you're talking about a content subject like social studies or science, because you could make a decision that because of the construction of your curriculum, maybe electricity is more important to go through this year than the structure of the cell, and you'll be able to get to the structure of the cell next year. When it comes to literacy, you're trying to teach a bunch of interrelated skills that the kids have to use in coordination with each other. So if you said, well, we're just going to worry about word recognition now, and we don't care if the kids understand what they're reading, or vice versa, it makes people like me tear their hair out. This is actually a problem we always have of how to prioritize these things. The way I handled it in the Chicago public schools as the director of reading, and the way that I would handle it if I were an individual teacher now trying to structure my lessons and figure out what to do with a whole class of kids, I would suggest that there are really 4 big clusters of things that you have to teach in literacy that those standards go into. One is certainly this stuff with words, the decoding it, words and parts of words, the letters and the sounds and the meaningful parts of words, all of that stuff. That deserves some instructional time on a regular basis. Erin mentioned fluency, which is more of a coordination thing. How do you decode while you're comprehending? You know, it might not be deep comprehension, but you're figuring out what this thing is saying on at least a surface level. And you have to do all that together, and you have to do it fast enough and without so much conscious attention. We need some fluency instruction in there. Comprehension, learning how to think about the ideas in text, learning how to deal with the written language, vocabulary, and that kind of thing. And then writing. I don't want to leave writing out of this. And so you have all four of those. In the Chicago schools, what we did is tied time to each of those. That the teacher was really supposed to put a quarter of the time into each of those. They could structure it 9,000 different ways, but if you weren't putting substantial amounts of teaching into all four of those things, you were making a big mistake. And I think if teachers would sort of think of the structure like that from day to day, that those are the things that they have to be addressing, it might be easier for them to coordinate those than thinking of, oh gosh, we got 27 standards that I'm supposed to address. I think they might find it a little bit more manageable and under their control.
Makes total sense. The bucketing of them and helping, district leaders and building leaders and instructional leaders really think about a coordinated effort to advance systematic learning as opposed to disparate learning, right? And we can all like chunk it all together and pull it all apart. We make those mistakes all the time because we think it's easier. Staying with this idea of prioritizing learning and pieces of learning, we know that assessment is a word that lots of people don't want to hear this year because it's going to, as Tim said, put their hair on fire or make them crazy. But assessment is knowledge. And so we also know there are problematic ways in which assessment has been used as gatekeepers and barriers, particularly for our most perpetually marginalized students, our students of color, our students who are acquiring English languages, and our students who are experiencing measures of poverty. How can assessment be used responsibly now? You know what I mean? So that we're not in this sort of tyranny of testing. There are lots of calls for states to dispel their statewide test this year, lots of arguments, lots of discussions going on, but how can assessment of learning be used responsibly now? And I will let whoever wants to jump in on that one to just go forth.
Erin, you want to start?
Okay, I'm a little bit inhibited because I'll reveal what I'm doing with assessment and then I'll see if it matches the experts. But I do like this theme of opportunity, which is, I think, well said, Tanja, in terms of how we're using assessments largely to sort kids and identify, right, who gets into gate and who stays in gen ed and who needs services. So given this format and again, this paradigm shift of, it's not unusual for me just to meet one-on-one with a kid via Zoom, and that presents an opportunity for me insofar as, doing inventories of different learning. I can do fluency online. It's relatively easy, share a screen and they can read across a page for me. And so I probably, ironically, in some respects, know my kids better than I have in the past because I have this intimate time with them. So I do think, some of these standardized assessments, that's the stuff that we need to give, really careful thought to. But I don't want to that whole idea, right? Assessment's not a pejorative. Instead, I love your framing of assessment as knowledge. And so it's an opportunity, again, to really get to know your kids. Whereas in the past, if I had just said, we're going to spend 30 minutes, you guys do something individually, I'm going to sit in the back of the room with this child, that wouldn't have been possible. And now it is, given the context that we're teaching in.
Nell or Tim?
I just want to say, Erin, that I think you're right on there. And, what Erin is describing is what we call formative assessment. And that's the kind of assessment where the point of the assessment is to inform day-to-day instruction. And right now, that's where our energy should be. How do we inform day-to-day instruction through our assessment practices? And in reading and writing, a lot of that involves listening to kids read and watching kids write. Those are really core processes that you need. Of course, you know, there's screeners and other things you want to worry about too, but on a day-to-day basis, I think those are really critical. And actually, next week, collaborators and I are releasing on my website a new tool called the Listening to Reading, Watching While Writing Protocol, which is just a tool to guide that process of just very informally guiding the process of what we can pay attention to when kids are reading and writing and how we can translate that into instructional targets. So I think you're right on with that. And I will take a stand and say that, and I have taken a stand that I do think that more formal kinds of assessments, particularly state testing, should be suspended for this year. I think the valuable time that we have with children and the amount of stress that children are under and that teachers are under, to add that to the mix doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't feel like what we should be prioritizing, not only because of the pandemic, but also because the nation is increasingly waking up to the ways in which anti-Black racism and implicit biases influence all aspects of education system, but certainly it's clear that testing has been used in ways that are oppressive and inequitable. So let's take a time out for a year. Let's reassess. Let's prioritize the formative kinds of assessments that Erin described. And then, you know, post-pandemic, we pick back up with a fresh lens and reinstate those assessments, hopefully with improvements that will better serve all of our kids.
I love that you're pushing against that widely accepted notion that maybe we should rethink our state testing. I want to ask you a little bit more on this as well. When you think about the ways in which standardized tests have been used, and we've shared on Twitter lots of that, you and I, so I've been lurking around in your site a little bit too. Want to know what you think about the absence of what has been deemed a sort of systematic or whole bodies of knowledge, right? So if we're going to focus on the formative, and we should, what does it mean if a district does not have their state level data, right? What does that do for exacerbating what teachers might focus on, or what teachers might decide, well, since I'm not going to test it, I don't have to worry about whether or not I teach that. So how does not having statewide assessments, summative assessment, impact teaching for students? And how might it also further create systems of oppression whereby students are undertaught? Because sometimes there's an under-teaching and a non-teaching if a teacher knows, and teachers use their instructional power all the time, and they make decisions about what they will and won't teach, particularly if something is or is not tested. So if there is no state testing, how then do we reconcile a person, a teacher, making the decision to under-teach or not teach?
I think that's a great question. I'm eager to hear what Tim has to say as well. But just to be clear, I'm calling for this moratorium for this year because we're in a pandemic and because we're in arguably multiple pandemics. So I'm not asking for a long-term, suspension of state testing. So I want to be clear about that. I think you're right. We treasure what we measure. And so if, we don't have measures that speak to certain things, then that definitely can influence what gets treasured. That said, I think these state tests need some work. And I think a lot of people think that these state tests need some work. Just anecdotally, I'll say I was giving a presentation to a large subset of the Wisconsin state legislature and staffers. And I picked a released passage from Wisconsin's third grade reading test. And, these third grade reading tests have tremendous stakes. As many of you know, they can really impact whether a child even moves to the next grade level, right? So I picked a passage and I took the questions that were on the test for that passage and I administered them in a poll, and significant portions of Wisconsin state legislators and staffers got the questions wrong. Now, I don't think that's speaks to this Wisconsin State Legislature and their staffers. I think it speaks to these tests. And, unfortunately, I have a little more knowledge about how the sausage is made. And I think we really do need to rethink and rework these tests. I'm excited about a lot of innovations in testing that are starting to get some attention, like shifting the passages on third grade reading tests so that they reflect the science and social studies standards of that state, so that we level the playing field somewhat, hopefully, among students in terms of not having, I recently saw a passage from a state test where the passage was about the process of getting maple syrup from trees in Vermont. Well, some kids are going to bring more knowledge to bear with that question than others. So shifting these tests so that they reflect what's actually been taught in science and social studies to level the playing field and incentivize attention and knowledge building is an example of the kind of change that I'd like to see. So, to be clear, I'm not anti-state testing, but I am pro suspending state testing this year, and I am pro trying to do a better job in constructing these instruments that have such high stakes for our children and for our teachers. Tim?
Thank you so much. Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, let me jump in quickly. I certainly agree with Nell that state testing should not be a priority this year, and delaying it or suspending it for a year makes great sense. But just two things. One, if the pandemic were to go on and we were in this situation again next year, I would suggest that we probably need to rethink that the priority of it might change in that kind of a situation. We might decide it's worth it. But the second idea is suspend it, but I would suggest in the year that we really do come back and that all or most of your schools are really going to be in session, I think you should consider actually doing a fall assessment that first year. For exactly the same reasons that both Aaron and Nell were saying, teachers need formative information. I think the states and the school districts and the individual schools need that kind of formative information too. We need to see how much damage this pandemic has done and where we're going to need to move resources, and a fall testing for that 1 year would really be a big help in that.
Aaron, you have anything to add to that?
I have just one really quick note, which is, this goes back to the very first question about opportunities here. And this is one of them, which is, unbeknownst to Dr. Shanahan, he's kind of gone viral in our community because he's declarative and he says things. And so for a lot of us, we took his YouTube video clips and we shared them. So if you're thinking about how we can think, very thoughtfully about assessment and you're trying to make the case, there's YouTube videos of Dr. Shanahan making these things for us. And so, if you want to see him break down an ACT study, he does it in an astonishingly charming way. And that's on YouTube. So that's what I'd encourage a lot of people watching right now, which is scale these really good ideas and use the technology we have to do it.
Yikes. Thank you, Aaron.
But nice to know you're viral. Didn't sound like a good thing. Now it's a great thing now. So the power of language and how language shifts is always important. We are coming up on our last idea. Can't believe our time has moved so quickly. Last question to each of you is a big question. What are your hopes that you want to leave our state boards of education with, for education that can be revolutionary? What is something you think could really, really turn the needle, turn the dial, move things forward in a truly revolutionary way? If we just did that one thing. So I know there is no one thing, but I'm going to ask you to go inside and pick a thing, right? So what is that thing that you want to leave them with, that nugget? Aaron, start us off. We'll go Aaron, Tim, and then Nell.
Well, I'm not a particularly profound person, but I guess if there's one thing, it's we're a product of design. And so we've touched on all of these themes that largely, we built. And I think this is a moment, this flex point in which, these things that we've been highly critical of, or we've had deep reservations about, we can start redesigning some of this. And it begins with some of these things we talked about, which is curricular resources, professional development, communication. We can design these things and we don't have to be beholden to sort of old paradigms.
That's a great one. I will say that one of the things that this crisis has highlighted for everybody is how critical the amount of education that kids get is, and that perhaps when the disease has been put under control and where everybody is able to be in place, I hope we will use some of what we've learned in these months to not just be satisfied with the amount of teaching our kids were getting before, but to use it to extend that and increase that, so children are getting really a much greater amount of educational opportunity than's been true in the past. And that's especially important in these equity issues where some communities are getting so much more than others.
I love both of those. It's hard to go last on this one, but I will say that I hope it's revolutionary, the degree to which we attend to research in making our instructional decisions. I feel like if nothing else, the pandemic has helped us to see the value of attending to research, how much we need to rely on research. So I hope that we continue to do that more in the education space. And the second is that I just hope we thank our teachers. I feel like finally the public at large is recognizing how important teachers are to our economy, to our well-being, to the well-being of our children, to our future. And I hope that we start to make moves that compensate teachers and respect teachers at the level that they deserve.
That is the best word to stop on. You have been fantastic panelists. I have enjoyed and learned so much, and I'm sure our attendees feel the same. Thank you for your time, and it's been a great afternoon with all of you. Thank you so much.
Oh, I agree. Thank you all for attending today's session.